This is it. This is where I'm supposed to be. And as a black...
Why we as Americans have to reconnect with our roots.
The depth of suffering and the height of joy that these songs can articulate.
One way that we can explain the Mother of God is in song. My mother.
So how did we get where we are today? A discernible shift in the place of effort.
What is most important in our lives.
Lighten my darkness. The Holy Spirit is able to.
He said, if you're going to participate in the movement, you've got to prepare yourself.
Thank you, Mother Catherine. Appreciate the opportunity, and good evening, everyone. So my name is Eduardo Bocanegra. I'm Senior Director for a large nonprofit organization here in the state of Illinois, in which I focus a lot of my time and work in violence prevention. And so you'll hear me in today's remarks talk a little bit about the work that I'm doing, how do I bring my faith into the work, and why this work is very meaningful to me, and I would say perhaps in light of what's happening in our country, why this topic is really important. Before I dive in there, I really want to share a quick vignette. In the line of work that I do, I have so many opportunities to meet people from all different walks of life, different backgrounds, different race, different gender. But for the most part, what I see most in common with the people that I serve is that they come from very marginalized, disenfranchised communities that have been overlooked, often because of poverty issues or because of victimization and race and so on. And I've been very blessed that in my line of work, I've been invited into the lives of so many people. And there's something powerful about that, something powerful when you're in the midst of individual suffering in times of vulnerability. And it grounds you right away in terms of the blessings that you have and how do you share those blessings that Christ has given you. So I want to start by sharing this vignette. It's a very personal one to me. And it's about a conversation between two siblings. These two brothers were sitting down one afternoon around a coffee table, about 4 feet by 4 feet. And they were having coffee and they were exchanging stories about their childhood. And these two brothers were also veterans of war. One brother was there sitting in his army dress-ups with his left lapel, beautiful ribbons and honors of his accomplishments in the military. And his other brother was more of a veteran of what perhaps many of us would constitute as a civil war. And I'm not here to define whether or not war is right or wrong, but what I would say is that in this conversation, they were exchanging stories that started off as children, memories about their home, about their mother, about the community. And slowly that conversation started progressing into the adult life. These stories became stories of war in which they experienced conflict, harm, victimization. And as both brothers were about to part ways, and as they're standing up, the younger brother in his military uniform was standing proudly. And the older brother was just looking at him at awe. And as he was looking at him, he couldn't stop wondering how some of those ribbons, some of those accomplishments that he had in his left lapel were based on violence, were based on inflicting harm on someone else, and how society and our government typically legitimize those acts of violence. And as he looked at his uniform, he had these dark, blue pants, and he had a light blue shirt on. And in his left lapel, he had a picture ID with the letter and the numbers of B75782, and underneath it stated the Illinois Department of Corrections, and the name was Eddie Bocanegra. This conversation that I'm sharing happened between my brother and I back in 2005, after my brother had served his second deployment in Iraq. It was throughout those conversations in which we saw the impact that trauma actually has in our lives, both as children, but even as adults. And this question about who legitimizes war and violence, who legitimizes, this idea of victimization. Who is a victim at the end of the day? And that conversation inspired what I would say launched the way that I think about the work in itself and my career path. And so I'm here to talk about today a program that I manage called Ready Chicago, READI, and stands for Rapid Employment Developing Initiative. It is a program that is focused on those who are at the highest risk of gun involvement. And these are individuals that are more likely to not only be shot, but they're also more likely to end up shooting somebody. So who exactly is it I'm serving? Well, let me give you a quick snapshot. The folks that are in my program, which is well over 670 men that we've served in the last 3 years, these are men who have about 17 or 18 arrests. 97% of my men in our program are African American. They're all over the age of 18, which about 85% of them are between the ages of 18 and 32. These are also fathers. 60% of the men that I serve are actually fathers. And close to 90% of the folks that I work with have also lost someone to violence. Now, here's the other interesting part. When I mentioned how many arrests they actually have, or the fact that 60% have done prison time, often it is those mistakes, those sins that cast a shadow over the fact that many of them have also been victims prior to their offenses. I know that according to police data and hospital data, that the men that I serve, over 80% of them have been victims of violence, either assault, stabbing, or shooting. As a matter of fact, well over 200 of the men that I serve have been victims of gun violence. Now, if I look around as someone who sits in various national committees and boards, I could tell you that besides hospitals, I don't know another program that serves this amount or this number of participants who've been victims of gun violence. But why do I say that? Well, because we live in a society that often overlooks their victimization. And the reasons are why. Why is it that certain acts of violence or certain victimizations are overlooked? And I can't help but to wonder, in light of what's taking place in our country, that this population that I currently serve have been overlooked for decades and not centuries. That because they're Black or brown, their victimization is overshadowed by the fact that when they were younger or older, they were involved in the criminal justice system. And we have so much science that demonstrates today that when a child is exposed to chronic violence and chronic trauma, your trajectory, your frontal cortex of your brain, for example, doesn't mature at the same rate that your average peer might from a different community. The other part that I would say is that many of the folks that we serve already started off at a disadvantage. Many of them come from single homes. We think about the war on drugs, for example, in which many of their fathers and grandfathers were arrested and done prison time, pulling away the male from many of these homes. And we think about other systemic structures that currently continue to create barriers for these men. Now, I recognize that the folks who are listening in, I'm probably preaching to the choir. There's probably not much that I'm saying here that's of any difference. But I want to point out one thing here. Several years ago, when I was running our youth work at the YMCA of Chicago, I was working with U.S. veterans and I was working with at-risk youth. And I was bringing them together based on this shared experience around trauma, around violence. And the idea was that because we know more about veterans and we tend to be more sympathetic towards veterans and the mistakes they make post-war, that we are more forgiving and more understanding. And so I wondered, what if we took these veterans and they help mentor young people? And these young people are also, for the most part, young kids who are in gangs, who are on probation or on parole for violent offenses most of the time. And we saw them not as these hoodlums or these gangbangers, but we saw them as individuals who are trying to heal from their own trauma, no different than veterans. So speeding forward, 3 years ago, Chicago was grappling right after a year in which we saw over 750 homicides, nearly 4,000 shootings in our city. And again, these shootings and homicides typically occur in concentrated communities. So for those who are not from Chicago, you often think about downtown, the city scrapers and all that. Well, let me tell you this, that's not where the violence is taking place. That's not where people are getting shot or being killed. Those are not the communities. The communities that I'm referring to are communities that, as again, have been disinvested for many, many years, if not decades. And so, as a result of 2016 spike in violence, foundations all came together in Chicago. The sports alliances, the Chicago Cubs, the White Sox, the Bulls, the Bears, the Blackhawks, and others came together to figure out what is our call behind all this. So, long story short, they decided to really put their money together and think about what can they do in the immediate level and what can they think about or invest in that will potentially help inform this topic of violence across not only Chicago but in our country. And so there are three buckets. One was addressing issues around policies. The second one was about law enforcement, whether it's training or accountability. And the third was where Ready Chicago falls in, a direct service. We know that the science tells us right now that employment helps to reduce violence. We also know that cognitive behavioral therapy with young people has also proven to reduce violence. So at Heart and Alliance, which is a 130 plus year organization, said, why not take a risk and let's marry these two principles and think about whether or not we will be able to see a reduction in violence in our city. So we partnered with the University of Chicago's Crime Lab, where they're doing a randomized controlled trial study, one that's very rare for this population. And we have been in this mission to see whether or not violence could be reduced through employment and cognitive behavior therapy. And ultimately, that is what Ready Chicago is. And so here's one of the things that I want to make sure that I leave behind with this audience is that there are a lot of violence prevention programs out there. Not all of them always target gun violence directly. Mentoring programs, outreach, violence interruption services, they're all necessary and very important, and they should be part of a strategy. But when you're working with people who are more likely to be arrested for a gun offense, if you want them to step away from something, then you have to give them something to step into. And ultimately, that is what Ready Chicago is. We provide 18 months of support social services by providing an employment opportunity right there on the spot. We tell somebody, put your gun down, I have a job for you. The second thing that we do is that jobs is just the entry point to kind of hook them. It's the carrot to the stick. For us, it's about cognitive behavior therapy. How do we help disrupt patterns of thinking? We shouldn't be surprised that often many of our young men in our program respond in a negative way, in a violent way, to what they would consider a very normal, hostile situation. You know, they get shot, you shoot back. Somebody threatens you, you shoot them first. Somebody disrespects you, well, that's your social capital there. That is your capital, right? Your reputation is what you have to hold on to, because the minute that reputation is questioned, then you become a victim for others around the neighborhood. And so how do we think about that? So a part of it is through what we used to do 3 times a week for an hour and a half at a time, and we would pay them for this, is provide cognitive behavior therapy. As of August 1st, now we're doing 5 days a week, an hour and a half at a time of cognitive behavior therapy. That's important for us because jobs is just the entry point. If you want people to retain these jobs, if you want people to be able to work with managers, especially when they're being told that they're doing something that's not correct, you want to make sure that you're preparing them in a way that they are able to receive conflict or constructive criticism and be able to build on that, which is a huge lack in our communities, to be quite honest. And so the program in itself, we highly target individuals who are the high risk. We look at police data, hospital data to identify those individuals. The second thing that we do is we are relentless with our engagement. These men that I'm referring to, they're not coming to us. It's very similar to the church. Often in church, and this is one of my pet peeves, we think about the church in our communities and we expect people to knock on our door and seeking Christ. The problem with that is the people who really truly need Christ are not coming to our door. So we, as Orthodox Christians, are responsible, I would say, to bring our ministry to them, to go out to the community, to find the individuals who are in the margins, the people who have been overlooked, the people that have been outcasted by society, the people who are drunks, who are drug addicts, who are in gangs, who are harming each other. Those are the individuals that we should be doing our ministry to. That same approach, the same approach that Christ took, is the same approach that I've decided to take with Ready Chicago. These men are what I would consider non-social service seekers. Again, they're not coming to our door looking for help. In fact, these are the same guys that through our census, right, that we're doing in our country right now, we can't get a hold of. And typically we can't do that. And even with nonprofits, typically what nonprofits do is they reach out to the people who are the closest to them, who they have access to. Rarely do we go out into the mist, into the jungle, into these abandoned homes and look for these individuals. And that's what we call relentless engagement. And even after we bring them on to our services and to our program, we recognize that progress is not linear. We recognize that people are not going to say, hey, here's an opportunity, now you run with it. People who've been harmed by the system, harmed by people they love, it takes a way different approach. And that's why it's upon us to really build those relationships. And at the end of the day, when I talk about employment and cognitive behavior therapy, the glue to that is the power of relationships. We have hired over 100 staff to do Ready Chicago. And I can tell you that the best staff that I have in our program typically fall in this category. They are people who have been in the system before, and they just want to do something with this opportunity because it's very cathartic for them. It's very healing to help others. The second is that they realize that the systems are constantly putting their foot on their throat. So they're trying to figure out, like, how do you work within the current system and fight that system? And lastly, is people who have a strong faith. It doesn't matter if they're Muslims, doesn't matter if they're Pentecostal, doesn't matter if they're Orthodox. In fact, I actually wish I would see more Orthodox in our community. But the truth is that those are the best people who are able to do this work because they're able to make those connections. And when I think about that, I think about how Christ is working through them. So what are we learning about Ready? Well, here's what I'll say. I could tell you, because as I mentioned earlier, through this randomized controlled trial study, that we are seeing about 24% of our participants that are in Ready Chicago less likely to be shot or killed. Now, here's the unfortunate part behind that. That in the last 3 years since Ready Chicago has been in operation, we have lost about 28 men in our program. 28 young men have been killed. And more than half of them were already in a pathway to want to do change. But the community they live in, the community they have their families, that they're raising their families, wasn't ready to adopt that change. meaning that the community itself was too slow to recognize that change. So what does that tell me? It tells me that sometimes we could put the best in people, and unless we're able to tackle the surrounding environment, we're not going to make huge strides. So while we've lost about 28 participants so far in the last 3 years, within 4 weeks, as a matter of fact, here in Chicago, we lost about 5 within a 4-week period through the Memorial Day weekend and 4th of July. That's not including those who've also been shot and survived their gunshots. The other part that I would point out behind it is this, is that when I think about those that we've lost, those who are in the control group, those that unfortunately I did not have the resources to provide services for, that number far surpasses that. Meaning those who are in the control group, those who are not receiving Ready Chicago, we're seeing more young men being killed to the streets. Second point that I'll mention is that we are also seeing over 70% of our participants in our program have been less arrested, meaning we have fewer of our men arrested for murder or attempt murder compared to the control group. So not only are we saving lives within our own participants in our program, we are saving lives within their own peers. These young men are not going out there shooting and killing somebody else. Over 70%. Now, the unfortunate part about all that is this, that you would hope that government supports these kind of initiatives, this kind of science, but unless people are more informed, unless people who are in this call are able to lift that up, it doesn't make a difference. Because the reality is that for every homicide that we have here in Chicago, and in fact, there's been several studies with 8 major cities here in the United States, including Detroit, Miami, and St. Louis, and a few others, that the average cost is between $1.4 and $1.5 million for every homicide. So taxpayers, that's what they're spending. In fact, we spend about $3.6 million for every person that either gets killed or is incarcerated. Overall, when you think about law enforcement, the hospitals, incarceration, the courts, including the prosecution. So one way or another, we're spending that money. So my question is, like, if we're spending that money already, why not put that money into communities that are struggling right now, which are often Black and brown communities? Now, I want to be very transparent about something that I just shared, which was my opening remarks about my own story. I served over 14 years in prison for a first-degree gang-related murder. I shot and killed somebody. I was 18 years old, and the young man who I shot was 18 years old. He was from a rival gang, a gang that actually shot 2 of my friends. And while he wasn't the person who shot my friend or my friends, he just happened to be the person that was with this group of individuals the night that I decided to retaliate. I say this to you with shame and a lot of embarrassment. And I know that Christ has forgiven me. But I will say this, I often struggle. I struggle because I think about all the missed opportunities with what God has given me, all the blessings, everything He's given me, and how I'm trying to multiply things. I think about the parable of the talents. Every time I have an opportunity to talk about Christ, every time that I think about here having an opportunity to do something to honor William, but to also practice what my faith is teaching me. And then I look around and I look at so much division across our country. And I'm not just talking about politics. I don't care for it one way or the other. I care about what's happening in our own church. I care about how you have clergy at times that don't fully understand specific movements, whether it's the Black Lives Matter movement, whether it's LGBTQ issues, whether it's around the homeless or gang issues or reentry issues. We create so much division around that. When did we stop seeking Christ in every person that we come across? And so I wonder all the time, like, if Christ was in this earth, what would Christ want me to do? where would Christ be at? Would he be in Central America and Mexico, walking with all these famous individuals that are crossing, the border? And I'm not here to debate whether it's right or wrong. What I'm saying is, where would Christ be at? Where would Christ be at with all this mass incarceration that the majority of them are Black and brown people? Where would Christ be at? And here in Chicago, we're seeing almost 600 homicides already this year so far. Where would Christ be at? Where is our church at? Because I can tell you that in Chicago, the Orthodox Church, doesn't matter if it's Greek, if it's Russian, OCA, they're not in the community. And it took for me 9 years ago to visit Kansas City to see there were Black people in the Orthodox Church. So I had to drive 9 hours to be able to see that. And that's a challenge for me as somebody who's Hispanic, as somebody who I bring my Orthodox faith in my work. I have the privilege of, I've visited the White House several times. I have the privilege of sitting some prestige boards and committees around these issues. And I remind people, depending when the appropriate time, about my faith in Christ. And I am not ashamed about that. Not one bit. But what I would say, and this is passing judgment on my part, and this is my sin in all this, that in light of what I just shared just a moment ago, I asked myself, this audience already knows these issues, perhaps better than anybody else. What about our other Christians, brothers and sisters? What about other clergy? When do we stop going to Mother Catherine and Father Moses and Father Turbo and others? And so I'll conclude by saying this. Having a record, gone to prison for what I went to prison for, reminds me of the story of the lepers. And when Christ enters this town, heals these 10 individuals, they all leave, and only one of them comes back. And the person that came back was a foreigner. He was a foreigner. It was a foreigner that came back and acknowledged Christ. And I think about when Christ was being crucified, who was by him being crucified as well? It was Dismas, a convicted felon. And we forget whether Christ was right or wrong, and we know the truth behind that already, that Christ was sentenced as a convicted felon. And I take refuge in that. I take refuge that knowing that I've been given this opportunity and this blessing to experience this journey and come the other side. And sometimes people think, right, and this is true to many of us as Christians, we could feed the homeless, we could provide soup, we could run all great programs, clothing, you name it, mentoring. They're all needed. And they're merciful. We show mercy through those kind acts. But I can't help but to wonder that those kind acts that we do are very selfish on our part because they make us feel good. We focus on the individual, and we think that the minute that we give this person this bowl of soup, that we've done Christ's work. And I would say we have, to a large extent. But here's two things that I would say. One is that those individuals, they don't need us. They don't need us. When I was in prison, I didn't need you to write to me. When I came home from prison, I didn't need you to close me. And outside of my family, nobody actually did that. I need the work that I do. I need the folks that I work with more than they need me. My salvation is dependent upon them. I'm not a theologian, but I know Christ. And it didn't take for me to become orthodox to know Christ. In orthodoxy, we're entrusted to have the faith that we are the faith. We are the church. And it's so ironic, man, that as people who believe that, we're not out in the community working with those who've been in the margins. Not all, but some. And the last thing that I'll say around leaving that comment is I think about mercy, I think about justice. The church is not just about mercy. As Christians, it's not just about mercy. It's not just about helping one another. It's about justice as well. It's about dealing with the root causes of individual circumstances. It's about focusing on change. Christ did that. The saints that we put up in our homes, that we venerate, look at their lives. And so I just think about, instead of thinking about all these kind of movements that are taking place in our country and saying how, they're not Christ-centered, think about what they're trying to do. And maybe in the midst of all that, we could find ourselves in finding Christ in the people that we come across. So on that note, I really appreciate this opportunity. I'm happy to share more about our data, about the work that we're doing with Ready Chicago. You're more than welcome to send me an email at ebocanegra, that's EBOCANEGRA, @heartlandalliance.org. Thank you for your time.